in the vast tapestry of human existence, there exists a profound mystery that few dare to acknowledge. Among us walk beings who appear fully human, yet lack the spiritual vibrancy that defines our deeper nature. These are not monsters or villains from stories, but ordinary people whose inner light has dimmed to near extinction. The renowned mystic Edgar once spoke of these individuals, describing them as souls asleep, physical bodies functioning perfectly, while the divine spark within them lies dormant. This is not a permanent condition of damnation, but rather a state of profound spiritual slumber that can persist for an entire lifetime if never awakened. What causes this spiritual dormancy? The answer lies in the gradual forgetting of love, not merely romantic attachment, but the universal force that connects all beings to the source. When we repeatedly choose fear over love, material gain over compassion, and isolation over connection, we create distance between our physical existence and our spiritual essence. These souls asleep move through the world on autopilot, driven primarily by basic instincts and logical calculations. They pursue careers, build relationships, and participate in society, yet something essential is missing. Their decisions stem from fear, ambition, or an inner emptiness, rather than from the authentic expression of spiritual purpose. You might recognize them by the hollowness behind their eyes, a certain quality that suggests nobody is truly home, despite all appearances of normalcy. Their laughter rarely reaches their eyes. Their words sound rehearsed rather than felt. They process emotions as intellectual concepts rather than lived experiences, observing happiness or sorrow as if studying foreign languages they cannot speak fluently. These individuals often gravitate toward positions and pursuits that reward rational thinking divorced from emotional intelligence. They may excel in environments that prioritize productivity over connection, achievement over meaning, and conformity over authenticity. Their success in such systems further reinforces their disconnection from spiritual awareness. The tragedy is not their condition, but their unawareness of it. Like sleepwalkers, they cannot recognize their state of slumber. The spiritual emptiness creates a void they attempt to fill with endless consumption, status seeking, or the accumulation of experiences that provide momentary stimulation without lasting fulfillment. Yet within each sleepwalker remains the potential for awakening. The divine spark never fully extinguishes. It merely dims to an ember, waiting for the breath of authentic connection to reignite it. This is the profound hope embedded within this teaching, that even the most spiritually dormant among us carries the seed of their own resurrection. The path to awakening begins with recognition, not judgment of others, but honest self-examination. We must ask, do we move through life automatically or with conscious presence? Do we make decisions from fear or from love? Do we seek connection with the divine in all things, or do we retreat into isolation? The sleepwalkers teach us, through contrast, what it means to be spiritually alive. They remind us that physical existence alone is insufficient for the soul's purpose. We are here not merely to survive and reproduce, but to evolve spiritually through conscious choice and loving connection. If you recognize these traits within yourself, know that this awareness itself is the first ray of dawn breaking through your spiritual night. The very capacity to question your spiritual aliveness demonstrates that your soul is stirring from its slumber. And if you recognize these patterns in others, respond not with condemnation but compassion, for each soul's journey unfolds according to its own timeline of awakening. The mystery of the soulless is not that they lack a soul, but that they have temporarily lost conscious connection with it. In this disconnection, they serve as mirrors for our own spiritual condition, challenging us to awaken more fully to the divine presence that animates all life. Among the spectrum of spiritually dormant beings walk those we might call the light imitators, individuals who have mastered the outward performance of goodness without experiencing its inner reality. These are not merely people who occasionally pretend kindness for social gain, but souls who have constructed entire identities around mimicking spiritual qualities they do not authentically embody. The light imitators present perhaps the most challenging spiritual paradox we encounter in our journey. They know what righteousness looks like. They can recite spiritual teachings verbatim. Their external behaviors often appear impeccably virtuous, yet internally, a profound coldness pervades their being. The warmth of genuine spiritual connection remains absent despite all outer appearances. Edgar cautioned that these individuals are like mirrors reflecting light, rather than sources emanating it. A mirror can brilliantly display the light it captures, creating the illusion of brightness, yet remains cold to the touch. So too do these imitators reflect the spiritual qualities they observe in others without generating the inner warmth that accompanies true spiritual presence. What distinguishes the light imitator from the genuinely spiritual person? The difference lies not in knowledge, but in embodiment. The imitator knows compassion as a concept to be intellectually understood and behaviorally replicated. The spiritually awakened person experiences compassion as a felt reality that emerges naturally from their connection to all living beings. The imitator studies kindness as one might study a foreign language, learning the grammar and vocabulary without ever dreaming in it. They observe how spiritually vibrant people respond to suffering, cataloging these reactions to reproduce them at appropriate moments. Their generosity follows careful calculation rather than spontaneous impulse. Their forgiveness adheres to spiritual principles they've memorized, rather than an authentic release of resentment. This imitation often begins innocently. Many spiritual traditions emphasize that right action can precede and eventually cultivate right feeling. Fake it until you make it contains wisdom about how external practice can eventually transform internal reality. The danger emerges when imitation becomes an end unto itself, when the performance of goodness becomes a substitute for the development of genuine spiritual qualities. Light imitators frequently gravitate toward religious and spiritual communities, where they can gain status through their apparent virtue. They may become ministers who preach love yet cannot feel it, spiritual teachers whose words inspire others despite their own inner emptiness, or philanthropists whose generosity serves image rather than compassion. Their spiritual vocabulary is extensive, their knowledge of texts and traditions impressive, yet the transformative power of these teachings remains theoretical rather than lived. The tragedy of the light imitator lies in how their performance prevents authentic development. By mastering the appearance of spiritual qualities, they believe they possess these qualities, closing themselves to the vulnerability required for genuine growth. Their spiritual pride becomes a barrier to the very awakening they outwardly represent. We must approach this teaching with profound humility, for each of us contains elements of the light imitator within ourselves. In our spiritual journeys, we all pass through phases where we emulate qualities we aspire to but have not yet fully embodied. The crucial distinction lies in our awareness of this gap and our willingness to acknowledge it. The light imitator serves as a spiritual warning about the dangers of prioritizing appearance over essence. They remind us that spiritual development concerns transformation of our innermost being, not merely the refinement of our external behaviors. Their presence challenges us to examine our own motivations. Do we practice kindness to appear kind, or because we genuinely feel connection with others? Do we speak spiritual truths to impress others with our wisdom, or because these truths have transformed our consciousness? For those who recognize these patterns within themselves, the path forward requires radical honesty. It demands acknowledging the gap between one's spiritual knowledge and one's lived experience. It requires the courage to admit when one's goodness emerges from calculation rather than authentic feeling. Only through such honesty can the light imitator begin to transform reflected light into self-generated warmth. When encountering light imitators in our lives, we are called to respond with discernment rather than judgment. Their inauthenticity often reveals itself through subtle inconsistencies, compassionate words accompanied by cold eyes, generous actions followed by subtle expectations, spiritual teachings that somehow leave listeners feeling diminished rather than uplifted. Yet even in these souls, the divine spark remains, awaiting genuine awakening. The very capacity to imitate light suggests recognition of its value, even if that recognition remains intellectual rather than felt. In this recognition lies the seed of eventual transformation. For what we consistently imitate, we may eventually become. In the hierarchy of spiritual dormancy, there exists a category of beings whose souls have not merely fallen asleep, but have crystallized into a state of rigid coldness. These are the frozen souls, individuals who have lost contact with the divine through the gradual hardening effects of pride, power, and vanity. Unlike other types of spiritually dormant beings, the The frozen souls have actively chosen their condition through repeated acts of self-elevation at the expense of spiritual connection. Edgar taught that these individuals represent one of the most profound spiritual warnings we can encounter in our earthly journey. They have committed the most ancient of spiritual errors, believing themselves to be gods, complete unto themselves, while forgetting that the essence of divinity is love that connects rather than isolates. This severance from the flow of divine love is not imposed upon them, but self-created through the fortress walls of ego they have meticulously constructed. The frozen soul typically begins as a being of great potential and capacity. Often blessed with intelligence, charisma, or talent, they possess genuine gifts that could serve the greater good. Yet somewhere along their journey, these gifts become twisted inward, serving only to reinforce their sense of superiority and specialness. What might have been channels for divine expression gradually transform into monuments to self. Pride serves as the primary architect of this spiritual condition. Not the healthy pride of dignified self-respect, but the inflated pride that requires elevation above others. This pride convinces the individual that they are exceptional, beyond the spiritual laws that govern ordinary beings, exempt from the vulnerabilities and interconnectedness that define the human condition. In its most extreme manifestation, this pride whispers that they are self-created, owing nothing to source or others. The freezing of the soul occurs gradually, often imperceptibly. Each choice to prioritize control over surrender, power over service, and self-glorification over humility adds another layer of ice around the spiritual heart. The individual may experience this process as increasing strength, mistaking spiritual rigidity for inner power. They become less affected by others' pain, less moved by beauty, less disturbed by their own moral compromises, interpreting this diminished sensitivity as mastery rather than loss. Edgar described the ego as the chamber where the soul suffocates when sealed off from divine connection. Within this chamber, the frozen soul creates elaborate justifications for their spiritual condition. They may develop philosophies celebrating power, rationalize exploitation as natural law, or even construct spiritual ideologies that place themselves at the center. Their inner coldness becomes reframed as clarity unclouded by sentimental weakness. The most revealing characteristic of the frozen soul is their relationship to vulnerability. They view vulnerability not as the doorway to authentic connection, but as a dangerous weakness to be eliminated. They respond to their own tender feelings with immediate suppression, to others' emotional needs with contempt, and to spiritual surrender with profound resistance. Having equated control with safety, they cannot allow themselves the openness required for spiritual vitality. These individuals often achieve significant worldly success precisely because of their condition rather than despite it. Their unencumbered pursuit of power, wealth, or status, unrestrained by empathy or spiritual values, frequently yields external achievements that further validate their chosen path. Society often rewards and celebrates the very qualities that reflect their spiritual freezing, reinforcing their belief that they have transcended ordinary human limitations rather than fallen prey to the most ancient of spiritual traps. In relationships, the frozen soul seeks admiration rather than connection, obedience rather than partnership, and reflection rather than authenticity. They surround themselves with those who mirror and magnify their self-image, creating environments where their spiritual condition goes unchallenged. Their closest relationships often involve people who either share their frozen state or who have surrendered their own spiritual autonomy to orbit around the frozen soul's gravitational pull. What makes this condition particularly tragic is how it transforms the individual's relationship to divinity itself. The frozen soul may maintain religious or spiritual practices, but these become performances aimed at controlling the divine rather than surrendering to it. Their prayers become demands, their meditations exercises in spiritual self-congratulation, their service calculated investments expecting specific returns. The divine becomes either a rival power to be matched, a force to be manipulated, or an irrelevance to be dismissed. Yet even in these seemingly hopeless cases, the potential for thawing remains. The frozen state, though potentially lasting a lifetime, is never the soul's true nature. It is an acquired condition that can be reversed through profound crisis or grace. When the elaborate structures of ego protection inevitably fail, as they must, the resulting collapse can create fissures in the ice, allowing the first warming rays of genuine humility to penetrate. The path to healing for the frozen soul begins with the recognition of their condition, a recognition that usually occurs only when their systems of control catastrophically fail. This failure might manifest as relationship collapse, health crisis, public downfall, or profound inner emptiness that can no longer be ignored. In this moment of forced surrender, the possibility of spiritual revival emerges. For those encountering frozen souls in their lives, the teaching calls not for judgment, but for appropriate boundaries and compassionate distance. These individuals cannot be thawed through argument or persuasion, but only through consequences that reveal the limitations of their chosen path. The most loving response is often to allow them to experience the natural results of their spiritual condition, while remaining open to genuine transformation should it occur. The frozen souls serve as powerful teachers of what happens when we mistake isolation for strength and control for mastery. They remind us that spiritual aliveness requires perpetual surrender, vulnerability, and connection, qualities that cannot coexist with the brittle fortress of pride. In their frozen state, they reflect by contrast the warm fluidity of the spiritually awakened heart. Among the spectrum of spiritually dormant beings walk those we might call the emotional voids, souls who have incarnated with the specific purpose of developing emotional capacity, yet have resisted this essential growth. Edgar taught that each soul enters physical existence with particular lessons to master, and for some, the primary curriculum centers on learning to feel, to develop the emotional intelligence that bridges intellectual understanding and spiritual wisdom. The emotional voids represent those who have actively or passively rejected this curriculum, choosing instead to remain in a state of emotional underdevelopment. Unlike other spiritually dormant types who may have lost connection to their feelings, these individuals never fully develop this capacity in the first place. They exist primarily in the realm of rational thought, approaching life as a series of logical problems to solve rather than experiences to feel. What distinguishes the emotional void from simply being rational or logical is not their intellectual capacity, but their profound disconnect from the emotional dimension of existence. While healthy individuals integrate reason and feeling, the emotional void treats emotions as irrelevant data points or inconvenient disruptions to rational processes. They may intellectually understand emotional concepts, but cannot genuinely experience the depth and nuance of feeling that defines the human condition. This state manifests in distinctive patterns of behavior and perception. The emotional void approaches relationships as transactions, evaluating others based on utility rather than connection. They view suffering, both their own and others, as problems to fix or inefficiencies to eliminate, rather than experiences containing wisdom. Their decision-making prioritizes objective metrics over subjective values, often missing the emotional implications that give choices their deeper meaning. In conversation, these individuals frequently redirect emotional topics toward intellectual analysis. When confronted with others' feelings, they respond with solutions rather than empathy, frustrated by the apparent irrationality of emotional responses. Their language tends toward abstraction, lacking the vivid imagery and embodied metaphors that naturally emerge from felt experience. They may pride themselves on being objective or not emotional, viewing this as superiority rather than limitation. The causes of this condition vary widely according to Edgar's teachings. For some, early trauma created a defensive severing from emotional experience, a protection mechanism that outlived its usefulness, yet persisted into adulthood. For others, cultural conditioning discouraged emotional development, particularly in societies or family systems that devalue feeling as weakness. Still others may have incarnated with this specific challenge as their soul's curriculum, a deliberate opportunity to develop capacities underdeveloped in previous existences. The spiritual consequences of emotional underdevelopment extend far beyond interpersonal difficulties. The heart center serves as a crucial bridge between lower and higher consciousness, between physical survival and spiritual awareness. When this bridge remains undeveloped, the individual experiences a disconnection between their intellectual understanding and spiritual insight. They may grasp spiritual concepts abstractly while remaining untouched by their transformative power. This explains why some individuals can accumulate vast spiritual knowledge while showing little evidence of spiritual growth. Their comprehension remains intellectual rather than integrated, unable to flow through the emotional channels that transform understanding into wisdom. Like trying to power a city through wires too thin to carry the current, their spiritual potential remains largely unrealized due to insufficient emotional capacity. The emotional void often gravitates towards spiritual traditions and practices that emphasize transcendence over embodiment, detachment over engagement, and abstract principles over relational ethics. These approaches can inadvertently reinforce their condition, providing spiritual justifications for emotional disconnection rather than challenging it. They may achieve states of mental clarity or conceptual understanding while missing the heart-centered awakening that constitutes genuine spiritual transformation. When the soul remains disconnected from emotional experience, it creates a specific quality of suffering characterized by meaninglessness rather than pain. The emotional void typically doesn't experience intense emotional distress, but rather a pervasive sense of emptiness or flatness, a gray world lacking the vivid colors that feelings provide. This emptiness often manifests as boredom, restlessness, or a persistent sense that something essential is missing from their experience. The path toward healing for the emotional void requires a fundamental reorientation toward embodied experience. Rather than approaching emotions as disruptions to be managed, they must learn to welcome feelings as messengers carrying essential wisdom. This journey typically involves practices that bypass intellectual defenses and directly engage bodily awareness. Movement practices, expressive arts, time in nature, or work with dream imagery. Relationships play a crucial role in this healing process, as emotions fundamentally develop in connection with others. The emotional void requires safe relationships that both honor their intellectual strengths and gently invite greater emotional engagement. Through consistent experiences of empathic attunement, they gradually develop the neural and spiritual pathways for authentic emotional experience. For those who recognize this pattern within themselves, the first step involves acknowledging emotional capacity as a strength rather than a weakness. This requires challenging internalized beliefs that elevate rationality above feeling, recognizing these as cultural distortions rather than spiritual truths. The journey continues through intentional exposure to emotional experiences in manageable doses, gradually building capacity much as one would develop any underdeveloped faculty. Those in relationship with emotional voids face the challenge of maintaining connection without collapsing into their emotional absence. This requires setting boundaries around emotional labor, expressing authentic feelings without expectation of reciprocity, and recognizing when the relationship dynamic reinforces rather than challenges emotional disconnection. The most helpful stance combines compassionate understanding of their condition with refusal to adapt to emotional absence as normative. Edgar taught that the soul silences itself when denied expression, yet never loses its fundamental capacity for feeling. Even in cases of profound emotional underdevelopment, the potential for awakening remains intact. The journey may be longer and more challenging than for others, yet each small opening to authentic feeling represents significant spiritual progress for these individuals. The teaching of the emotional void reminds us that spiritual development encompasses all dimensions of human experience, not merely the transcendent or intellectual, but the embodied and emotional as well. It challenges spiritual traditions that devalue feeling as merely human to recognize emotion as a divine faculty essential to our spiritual functioning. In the integrated wisdom of the fully developed heart, we discover not a distraction from spiritual truth, but one of its most profound expressions. In the spiritual landscape we have explored, we now turn to a profound message of hope, the truth that not all who appear soulless are beyond redemption. This final teaching addresses those who manifest the characteristics of spiritual dormancy, yet stand at the threshold of awakening. Edgar taught that the divine spark never truly vanishes from any being. It may dim to near invisibility, retreat into the deepest recesses of consciousness, or lie buried beneath layers of disconnection, yet it remains eternally present, awaiting conditions favorable for its resurgence. The redeemable ones represent souls in transition, beings who have experienced profound spiritual dormancy, yet contain within them the stirring of renewal. They may externally resemble the sleepwalkers, imitators, frozen souls, or emotional voids we have explored, yet internally subtle shifts have begun. Like the barely perceptible greening of branches before spring's full arrival, these souls carry the first tentative signs of spiritual reawakening that may yet blossom into full consciousness. What distinguishes the redeemable from the persistently dormant is not external behavior, but inner orientation. While both may exhibit similar patterns of disconnection, the redeemable one has developed a crucial capacity, the ability to question their condition. This questioning may manifest as vague dissatisfaction with a life that outwardly appears successful, persistent emptiness despite achievement, or moments of longing for something they cannot name. These experiences represent the soul's first attempts to communicate its desire for awakening. Edgar taught that spiritual dormancy often serves an evolutionary purpose within the soul's larger journey. Some beings choose periods of disconnection as a form of rest between intensive growth cycles. Others require the experience of separation to develop appreciation for connection. Still others descend into spiritual sleep as protection during periods when full consciousness would overwhelm their developmental capacity. What appears as permanent soullessness to our limited perception may represent a temporary phase within an immortal soul's vast curriculum. The awakening process typically begins through one of three catalysts: transformative suffering, unexpected love, or the direct intervention of grace. Suffering often initiates awakening when established patterns of disconnection fail to buffer against life's inevitable losses, when control structures collapse, when emotional barriers prove insufficient, when rational defenses cannot explain away existential pain. These moments create fissures through which the first light of authentic spiritual awareness can penetrate. Equally powerful is the catalyst of unexpected love, encounters with beings whose spiritual aliveness bypasses the dormant soul's defenses. These may be spiritual teachers whose presence communicates beyond words, children whose natural authenticity awakens forgotten qualities, beloved companions whose unconditional acceptance creates safety for vulnerability, or even animals whose unguarded presence invites connection. Through such encounters, the dormant soul glimpses possibilities of being that challenge its limited self-concept. The third catalyst, grace, represents direct spiritual intervention beyond human orchestration. These moments arrive as spontaneous awakenings, profound insights arising without apparent cause, or mystical experiences that temporarily dissolve the boundaries of separate selfhood. Though such interventions cannot be manufactured, traditions across cultures teach that they can be invited through sincere spiritual aspiration, creating conditions where grace may more readily enter. The awakening process for those long dormant rarely follows a linear path. Unlike beings who have maintained spiritual connection, the redeemable ones typically experience awakening as disorienting and destabilizing, challenging everything they have understood themselves to be. The process resembles birth more than growth, a passage through a constricting darkness into blinding light, accompanied by the pain of emergence and the shock of new perception. This explains why spiritual awakening often manifests initially as crisis rather than enlightenment. As awareness increases, the formerly dormant soul confronts the consequences of disconnection, the relationships damaged by lack of empathy, the harm caused through spiritual blindness, the emptiness created by purpose unfulfilled. Before the joy of connection can be fully experienced, the pain of its absence must typically be acknowledged and integrated. Edgar taught that this integration process requires both compassion and accountability. The awakening soul must extend compassion toward its former limitation while taking full responsibility for its impacts. This delicate balance prevents both the paralysis of shame and the bypass of premature transcendence. Through this honest reckoning, the awakening soul establishes authentic foundation for genuine spiritual development. The signs of genuine awakening in previously dormant souls have distinctive qualities. Rather than dramatic spiritual experiences, authentic awakening often manifests as simple yet profound shifts, increasing capacity to feel both joy and sorrow, growing awareness of interconnection with all life, diminishing need for control, greater comfort with uncertainty, and spontaneous compassion emerging without effort or calculation. Perhaps most telling is the humility that accompanies genuine awakening. a recognition of how much remains unknown despite what has been revealed. For those who recognize themselves in these descriptions, the teaching offers specific guidance. The awakening process requires patience above all, the willingness to allow transformation to unfold according to its own timing rather than the ego's demands. It requires community, relationships with others committed to consciousness who can mirror both progress and blind spots. It requires practice, consistent engagement with disciplines that develop neglected capacities. And it requires profound self-compassion, gentleness toward the inevitable setbacks and regressions that accompany any significant transformation. Those witnessing the awakening of formerly dormant souls face their own challenges. Having encountered these individuals in their disconnected state, observers may dismiss early signs of transformation as manipulation or performance. The teaching encourages discernment without cynicism, the capacity to recognize authentic change while maintaining appropriate boundaries until new patterns stabilize. It reminds us that genuine transformation often proceeds unevenly, with aspects of the former condition persisting alongside emerging awareness. The teaching of the redeemable ones serves as both warning and promise. It warns against the spiritual arrogance of categorizing any soul as permanently lost, recognizing that our perception remains limited to present manifestation rather than eternal potential. Simultaneously, it promises that no degree of disconnection, however profound or prolonged, permanently separates any being from the possibility of awakening. This understanding transforms how we perceive apparently soulless beings in our midst. Rather than objects of fear or condemnation, they become fellow travelers on a journey we all share, a journey of remembering our divine nature and expressing it through human form. Some travel this path with relative continuity, others experience profound detours into forgetting. Yet the destination remains available to all, regardless of where along the path we currently find ourselves. The final wisdom of this teaching lies in recognizing that redemption is never something we bestow upon others, but rather a natural process we can either support or obstruct. The divine spark awakens according to its own wisdom and timing, responding to conditions we can help create but cannot control. Our role lies not in judging who deserves awakening, but in maintaining faith in its possibility for all beings, creating environments where spiritual dormancy naturally gives way to aliveness, and recognizing with celebration each evidence of the eternal light rekindling within souls long darkened. In this recognition, we participate in the universe's fundamental movement toward greater consciousness, a movement that ultimately leaves no soul behind in darkness, but eventually, in ways and timelines beyond our limited comprehension, draws all beings back into the awareness of their true nature as expressions of divine love. If this teaching has illuminated something within you, take a moment to reflect on your own spiritual journey. We all experience moments of disconnection and awakening throughout our lives. Subscribe now to continue exploring these profound spiritual truths that can transform how you understand yourself and others around you. Your subscription supports the sharing of this ancient wisdom in our modern world. Leave a comment sharing which of these 5 soul types resonated most deeply with you or someone in your life. Your perspective might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear on their path to awakening. Remember, in recognizing these patterns, we grow in compassion, both for others and ourselves. The journey continues, and I'm grateful to walk it together with this community.